Hey, thank you, Jim. And good morning, everybody. You want to hit the lights on your way out? Perfect. There we go. If we can, I don't know, Dean, can you maybe close that up a little bit? We get a lot of glare through there. Appreciate it. Okay, thank you for coming this morning. As Jim said, there's a lot of things that you could be doing, maybe should be doing, because, I don't know, the last forecast I heard for tomorrow is now they're not talking a chance of rain, they're talking snow, right? 90% by tomorrow night. So, but it can be worse elsewhere. I was on a conference call earlier this morning, and there was a gentleman from central Illinois, just a little ways from Peoria, and he said they were supposed to get a dusting of snow last night. They got 4 inches. And he said there's still 10 to 15% of the corn and beans in the field in that area. So, you know, it's getting to be a time of the year to get this stuff wrapped up. There's no doubt about that. And we're kind of on the downhill side of wrapping up this round of meetings. We had a total of 9 meetings scheduled for this week. This morning we're here at Brewster, this afternoon over at Wilmot, and then tomorrow we go east to some of the new customers that we've been building relationships with since the Cargill facilities were acquired in those areas. So we're glad you're here. We had really good turnout on Monday and Tuesday when the weather was kind of not so good. Yesterday it started slacking off a little bit, and we kind of anticipated it today too. So, you know, it's tough to schedule these meetings at the perfect time. We thought if we waited a week, field work would be farther along, but then you're bumping up against Thanksgiving, and if you wait into December, then all of a sudden you're getting into a lot of holiday stuff. So we're going to go through the numbers while they're fresh. As we get started, we're going to go through a lot of information today, and quite honestly, I'm going to tell you right now that especially on the soybean side, it's not going to be real positive and can be almost a little bit depressing at times, but the fact of the matter is we kind of have to move on. So we're going to start out with a thought for the day here in Skol Purple Vikings, right? Skol Vikings, this is our year, supposedly. We'll see. We'll see how they play Sunday night, right? Well, as we think about things, our past is our teacher. So we can look back and see once what the markets have done, what yields and stuff have done, and we can learn from that, but sometimes, you know, it always has to come to the present because things can be different. And the present is where we're going to find our opportunities. That's today. That's what's going on right now. And then, of course, the future is our friend, because if we're lucky enough and fortunate enough to be a part of the future, it means what? We're still here. We're still alive, right? And then if we're alive in the future, we're back to being in the present, and that's when our opportunities present themselves. So today's meeting, we're going to go back to a week ago today on November 8th when the USDA had their November crop production report. Now we have to remind ourselves that this will be the last crop production report that the USDA releases in the year 2018. So we've got quite a stretch here from November 8th until mid-January before we get the final crop production report for this 2018 crop. So the market has over 60 days to kind of digest and throw rocks at this stuff and see once what sticks and what bounces off. In December, we'll have another supply and demand report, and we'll go through the supply and demand tables that they gave us last Thursday. And then we're going to spend a fair amount of time on the global situation. A real kind of bombshell was dropped on the market last week. I'm going to call it the China corn surprise. The USDA released a revision of the production and usage numbers in China for corn and wheat over the last 10 years. And it definitely caused some market concerns briefly, and now we're trying to digest what does it really mean, does it mean anything? We'll talk a little bit about the trade war. A lot of things bubbling again this morning about the fact that story released this morning on the press, China sends written response to the U.S. trade reform demands. Now, where that could just be viewed as another article, that's could be a very significant piece in the negotiations. Because all along, President Trump has been saying, I want this in writing, what you're willing to do, China, to settle this thing. And up to this point, it had all been just words. So if they're serious, this could be a step in the right direction. And keep in mind, the last week in November, the G20 summit in Argentina, President Trump and the President of China have more or less agreed to get together and talk about this thing. So there's a lot of information trying to be developed and put together ahead of that meeting so that they can maybe actually get something done. We'll also look at South American corn and soybean production. Unfortunately, the news there is not good for the American farmer. Because of the strong demand by China when they refused to buy U.S. soybeans and corn, they've shifted all of that demand to South America. Brazil literally ran themselves out of corn and beans, and because of that, there was a price premium, and the farmers were encouraged to plant more and to plant earlier. And so far, the weather's been good, so the production side of South America looks to be good, which isn't really what we want to hear, but once again, we have to stay in the present and work with the facts that we have. We'll talk a little bit about weather, both in the U.S. We're getting far enough along now where we can get an idea of what the forecast might be as we get into December and January and February. We'll also talk a little bit about the El Nino that we're in right now. Now, a year ago, we were talking about the other side of this weather phenomenon called the La Nina. So the El Nino is a different cat, and what does that mean for yields possibly in the U.S. in the coming year and also in South America? We'll look at some corn and soybean price charts. As Jim said, he has a few things to talk about that as far as new marketing things or existing things that are available for you to use to try and enhance your prices. And your questions and your comments are always welcome. So feel free, you don't have to wait until the end. If there's something you're not sure about or you have a question, concern, just please pop up at any time. So we're going to start with the production side, and that's what we have up on the top of this slide, corn on your left-hand side, soybeans on your right. And I really like the way this slide is put together. It's a friend of mine that I've worked with since 1980, Jerry Gerlach, and he does a progression as far as yields for the USDA and what they've done month by month. And we start out with July because that's when the crop is kind of far enough along where we start getting people to be willing to actually put yield estimates out. We see that on the corn side, 174, 178 in August, 181 in September. Up to that point, the crop was doing what? Getting bigger. And the old adage is bigger crops tend to do what? Get bigger. So the market was thinking that trend would continue as we got into October, and then the October yield estimate, a little bit of a curveball where the USDA actually took 0.6 of a bushel off. Not a big thing, but a little bit of a shift. And then all of a sudden, when we came to last week's number, the market was expecting this yield to be pretty much unchanged, maybe down to 180, but not below that. And the USDA actually dropped that yield 1.8 bushel per acre nationwide down to 178.9. Now we'll look in a little bit here what that may mean as far as that final production number when we get to January. There's a pretty definite trend on corn. And we'll look at history and give you an idea of what we think is going to be released in that January report. What about soybeans? 48.5 in July, 51.6, 52.8, 53.1. Bean crop just kept getting bigger. And the thing that was really bothersome about that is as the bean crop in the field was growing, getting larger in yield, is when we started getting into the depths of this trade situation with China where they basically quit taking any U.S. beans. It's had some dramatic effects on our supply and demand table that we'll look at a little bit later. So as we come down here to the second part then, the ending stocks or carryout, people will refer to both. We have last year's on here. Now this is what we ended up with for ending stocks on August 31st, 2018, the last crop year. The new crop year starts on September 1st and goes until August 31st, 2019. So when we look at these ending stock numbers, this is what's left over on August 31st, the coming August 31st. We keep last year's on here just as kind of a reference point. So let's look at corn. As the ending stocks in July at 1.55 billion, as the yield was going higher on corn, our ending stock number was also going up a little bit. And as that goes higher, it tends to put a little bit of pressure on prices. As we look at the November report now, with the yield coming down 1.8 bushel per acre, ending stocks also came down to 1.73. Now when we compare that to a year ago, we see the ending stocks on corn down about 400 million bushel. And that should mean what? higher prices. That's the way it's supposed to work. And when we get to the table and look at the price projections, we'll see that is what the USDA is giving us for ideas right now. What about soybeans? Well, last year we ended up with 438 million, and if you remember what last year was like, people were looking at that 438 saying, you know, that's quite a few beans. That's like 2 to 3 times what we've been carrying over in previous years. So that's a little bit burdensome. And then we bring the China situation in and a very good crop in the field. In July, the ending stocks on beans 580, 785, 845, 885. Last Thursday, 955. Can that be right? A soybean carryout of almost 1 billion bushel? Folks, this is what's left over on August 31st. And after August 31st, within 3 weeks, what do we start doing? Harvesting another crop. And I think this is why the market, if you have watched the soybean market over the last few months, and especially since this report came out, it seems like it's really pretty indecisive. It doesn't know where to go. We've never been in a situation like this before in the U.S. So we're kind of searching for what the market value is. You can say, well, beans are up 9 to 10 cents today off of this rumor that we maybe fix some of this trade stuff. And we'll talk as we go through this about what that might mean to the market, if that's really going to fix a lot of things or how that all shakes out. Here's a map that compares corn yields in November now versus the previous forecast, which was in October. Now, I want to clear it up right now so that we don't have any hard feelings, because there's been times at meetings people have said afterwards, you know, you made a comment that was politically motivated, and we don't appreciate that. So I want you to tell you right now, this is not a red and blue map based on politics, okay? We want to clear that up right now. What this means here is the red states have lower yields than the previous forecast in October. For instance, Minnesota, biggest change in the nation, down 7 bushel per acre on corn yield for the state, down to 184. Now, have you guys ever been in a situation where you said something and it turned out to be right? Does that feel good? Okay, well, I've got to share this with you. I participated in a couple of conference calls. Been doing it for over 20 years, so they just keep calling. One of them is at 7:30 on each Monday morning, and we have people from every Corn Belt state, and like in Iowa, some of the bigger states, 5 or 6 people. I'm one of 2 from Minnesota, and going way back to May and June when we started putting early yield estimates out, and they said, what do you think of the Minnesota corn crop? I said, here's what's happening in Minnesota. First of all, our corn crop, most of our corn crop was planted 3 to 4 weeks later than normal. Then we had too much rain in June, then we had too much rain in July. We've pushed the fertilizer down. Our crop is going to be down. What do you think it's going to be? 184 to 185. And you can check. I've been saying that since June. They finally listened. 184. I honestly think that crop could come down a little bit more in Minnesota in that January report. Now, I don't know if we're going to go a whole lot lower because the government tends to make changes real gradual, but I can definitely see that thing slipping down to 180, 182. Why? When you survey seed companies across Minnesota, and granted, test plots aren't the cure-all, but they also have customers who report. I'm seeing seed companies overall behind the scenes saying Minnesota corn yields down 39 bushel from a year ago. Now, there have been some phenomenal yields, even in our area. Talked to a producer that was here at our first meeting and said, you know, I hate to admit this, but my son's corn went 220 this year. Everything, average. But it was planted early, all on well-tiled ground. That makes a difference. I can take you to other people over in along the I-90 corridor, Jackson to Fairmont to Blue Earth. Prime ground, right? That took corn out 120 to 140. In our area here, we're hearing a lot of people talk about yields being down 40 to 50 bushel from a year ago. Southwest District, South Central, this is the prime stuff of Minnesota. Now you go north of Marshall, Wilmer, St. Cloud, sandier soil, the rain didn't bother them, phenomenal crops. So $1 million question, but I still think that could be a little lower. And we see some of the other states with pretty substantial changes. Iowa down 6. The people on the conference call really think that Iowa is still too high at 198. They're calling the Iowa crop more like a 195, 196. These aren't disaster type yields, but they're not records. And even Illinois, this 210 with a little number sign behind it means that's a state record for Illinois. The folks in Illinois do not buy that. They think it's too high. And like I said, there's parts of Illinois not done harvesting yet. There's going to be some field loss at this point in time. So, bottom line is 1.8 down to 178.9 in this report. I think that thing drifts a little bit lower as we go to that final January report. Here's how the USDA comes up with the yield. They look at the pounds per ear and chart that against the number of ears they find per acre. Now the change from October to November, you see they found just a freckle more ears as far as population, but the ear weight was down a fair amount, and that's where that drop of 1.8 bushel came from. Now the harvested acres were left unchanged in this report. That also could be adjusted in the January report, but we really don't know. Gut feeling right now, I would say there's a tendency we could maybe lose a few harvested acres because of some of the damage we had from the hurricanes that affected the Delta in some of the states in the southeastern United States. But really from this chart, we look at total corn production and historical perspective going back 20 years. We see that the 14.6 billion this year, pretty much identical to a year ago. This is not a record corn crop that we just raised. It's the third largest in history, but it's not a record. But here's something interesting to think about. This is the third largest corn crop we've ever raised in the U.S., and what's happening to our ending stocks on corn? They're going down. That means what? Our demand is very good. And that's encouraging, right? That's what we need to have happen. Keep this slide in mind when we get to the same type of analysis on soybeans, because you'll see it's quite different on the bean side of things. This is what I was telling you about as far as history now, what to expect in that final crop production report in January. What this chart looks at is years when the corn yield was raised in September, lowered in October, and lowered again in November. What did it do in January? And this would be 0 if everything was unchanged. So here you're up in September, down in October, down in November, down in January. That's 1990. See the pattern in 2006? 2007? Where are you going to plug this one? Probably lower, right? Now, there are some people out there in this world that sometimes can be labeled eccentric or crazy. Jerry Gerlach introduced me to a person that maybe could be listed that way. He's a little bit on the far edge. People have called him crazy in the past. We're just going to refer to him as Johnny Mack. He's been doing analysis of corn yields in the United States for 28 years. He's now, I think, probably about in his mid-70s. He called me up once last week because Gerlach told him, call Uttech and find out what he thinks about the Minnesota corn yield. This was before the report. The guy was on the phone for over 30 minutes. I didn't get a word in edgewise. Talking a mile a minute, and he's telling me what he's done and all this. Anyway, point being, over the 28 years, he's built very close relationships with all the seed companies across the United States. And he puts all of this information into a computer model he's developed and spits out what he thinks the yield actually is in the U.S. Now, last year, he'll admit that he was wrong, but everybody missed the yield last year because it turned out being much higher than what people thought. The later harvested crops turned out better. What's he finding out this year? He firmly believes, not that the USDA is going to share that because maybe we can't stand the truth. Remember that movie? He believes the corn yield is somewhere between 172 and 175. USDA is at 178. Would that put a little bit of a shock through the market if that came out in January? Possibly. But history tells us that's what we probably should expect. Maybe not to that degree, but if you look at past experience, down a half a bushel, down 2+, and down nearly 2 bushel. So could that yield in January be 176.8? And if that happens, all of a sudden that carry out of 1.7 could slip down to 1.4, 1.5, which should mean what? Even better prices, right? Here's our supply and demand table on corn. Last year's, for kind of a reference point, we see the carryout at $2.14 billion. Average price for the year on cash corn, including Minnesota, $3.36. So what did they do in this report from October to November? Here's our yield coming down 1.8 bushel per acre. That took 152 million bushel of corn out of production, out of the supply side of the equation. Now the USDA also said, well, if prices are going to be higher, we may see a little bit of a reduction in demand. So they reduced feed and residual 50 million down to 5.5. They reduced exports 25 million to 2.45. So we lost 152 of supply. We also lost 75 million of demand. So net change was 77 million bushel down to 1.736. Now there's a ratio that the market in general watches very closely, and that's called stocks to use ratio. How do you determine that? You take this ending stock number of 1.736, divide it by the total demand of 15.080. If you do that, you'll see that that stocks to use ratio is now 11.5%. Now there's been 12 times in recent history where we've had that at 12% or less at this time of the year. 9 of those 12 years, the high in July corn futures in Chicago came after the first of the year. So that kind of supports what we're talking about, you know, the possibility of a lower yield in January and maybe this carryout coming down a little bit. Of course, you know, the USDA, we may see this yield go down in January, but they may play with demand and leave the carryout unchanged. We'll have to wait and see. Now, if I'm a producer, what do I do with this information? There's all kinds of numbers. What we recommend is the first thing a producer looks at is this average price range. As we start out the year, the USDA will give us a range of what they expect for prices, and as we get closer, once we get to the end, they'll have the average price locked in. That range narrows up as more unknowns become known. Right now, we see from month to month, they brought the bottom price projection up 20 cents to $3.20, the top at $4. So the average price projection on corn by the USDA in November is $3.60. Comparing that to last year, it's about 24 cents higher, which kind of makes sense, right? With the smaller ending stocks. So if I'm a producer, what do I do with that information? I want to start with that average price of $3.60, and that's what I want to kind of use as a benchmark in my marketing plan. Now, I don't sell the whole crop there, but I watch very closely once we get there and maybe sell some, and if and when the market works higher to this upper end of the range, I want to get more aggressive on selling. And if and when we get to $4 cash corn, please don't call up and say, what do you really think? Unless something major has happened. But, you know, really, most years, if you abide by that type of discipline, honestly, folks, you'll usually end up okay. Now, as we get farther into the crop year, we have to be careful, because if we get farther into the crop year, there's a possibility that these higher prices come when? Early in the crop year. That happened last year in soybeans. Anybody remember that? We harvested beans, and beans started rallying, basis started narrowing, and we were just under $10 cash beans. And what did most of us do? They're finally getting right. It's just getting started, right? And then what happened? We never got a spring rally, we never got a summer rally, and the market just drifted lower. So sometimes we have to really watch things closely. What about from a historical perspective now on corn? This looks at ending stocks going all the way back to 1988, 30 years ago. And we can see a trend here. This is the third consecutive year now where our ending stocks going down on corn. That means our prices should be working higher, which is what they've been doing. Stocks to use ratio on this chart shows a 12%, but trust me, if you divide the numbers, it's 11.5. Here's soybeans. Same thing. The red states have lower yields versus a previous estimate in October. The gray states are unchanged. The blue states are higher. Now, I don't know about the Minnesota bean yield. I'm really mixed. I was feeling pretty strong before we did these meetings, and I've been able to talk to a lot of producers basically from Garrettson, South Dakota, all, pretty big area. And gosh, I really thought this Minnesota yield was too high, that it should be more like about 49, 49 and a half, because 50 bushel bean yield statewide in Minnesota is only 2 bushel off our all-time record. And I just didn't see that good of beans around here, in our area especially. Now, I've heard from other people, yeah, well, once again, you get into this area north of Marshall, and there's a lot of 70 to 80 bushel beans taken out. So maybe we're okay. The other thing that bothers me about this map, when you look at this, almost every state that raises soybeans to any degree showed what from October to November? Decrease in yields. Now, how did Minnesota and North Dakota, how were they exempt from that? Because if you ask people, why did the bean yield go down 3 bushel in Iowa, they're going to tell you, we didn't have very good fall weather. We had snow, we had wet, heavy rains, the pods would get dry, and then they'd get wet, and then they'd get dry, and some ended up on the ground, and some split open, but that didn't happen in Minnesota, right? We were exempt from that weather, so I don't know. I had an interesting conversation with a gentleman at the meeting in Laverne yesterday who had just came back from deer hunting out in Montana. And he said the thing that surprised him when he drove across North Dakota, he said, you get just like towards the central part of the state where they still have a fair amount of corn and beans. He said, over half of the crop is still in the field. He said, I don't know what they're thinking. There's beans, he said, God, but maybe his assessment was, they haven't raised beans for that long in North Dakota, and maybe they don't realize you really can't leave those out over the winter. So,
weren't they saying before harvest there was no storage for beans?
And I think that could be the other thing that we talked about. And that's what I told him. I said, do you realize what the market is for North Dakota beans? And he said, no, tell me. Mankato, Minnesota. And think of that freight bill. And how long does it take to truck, North Dakota started raising beans. Why? To meet Chinese demand off the P&W by rail. And honestly, we could bring Keith in here right now, and he's going to tell you there is no bean bid on the P&W, the West Coast. So these folks here that have soybeans, oh yeah, they've got a plant in Volga, South Dakota. That's not going to take the North Dakota crop. You've got 2 plants in Mankato, Minnesota, but look at the haul. And I think you might be right, Tim. I think there were some elevators in North Dakota that said, we'll take beans up to this point, but then we're going to take corn. And when we take corn, we're not going to take beans. How'd you like a co-op that did that to you? You won't find that at New Vision, right? That's never going to happen here. Bottom line is, nationwide yield down 1 bushel to 52.1. I don't know. I've got a sinking suspicion that as we get to that January number, now the bears on the bean side of things are saying, oh, don't worry about that. That's going to bounce back. We're going to be back above 53. I think this bean yield may go a little bit lower. Some of the beans that are harvested late, that last 10% or so, I don't know how well they're going to do. I think there could be some beans that don't get harvested. So we'll have to wait and see. There's not as definite a history on bean changes into that January report as there is on corn. In fact, on beans, it's about 50-50 whether we're higher or lower. But what history will tell you on bean yields from November to January, it usually doesn't change much. Maybe 0.2, maybe a half of a bushel, that's about it. On the bean yields, they look at the grams per pod and then the pods in an 18-foot square. In this report, you can see the pod weight once again was quite a bit lower than October, but they actually found more there. Someday I want to meet one of these enumerators that count pods. I pull up a bean plant and I get bored with one plant. And somebody out there is actually counting the pods in an 18-foot square. Gosh, it's either got to be real good money or it takes a unique person, right? Here's the slide I wanted to show you on soybean production. This looks quite a bit different than corn, doesn't it? Corn was our 3rd largest crop ever, but what about the bean crop we just harvested? It is what? Largest ever. Now, this is not good news because we're following up the largest crop in history in the U.S., but we're following up the largest crop in history out of Brazil. And in between those two crops, we get involved in a trade war with our largest customer and the largest soybean customer in the world. That's not a recipe for success, is it? It's kind of, we got problems to work through then. Here's our supply and demand table on soybeans. Last year's 438 million carryout ending stocks where we ended up, average price of $9.33. Ooh, wouldn't it be nice to have that again this year? What happened? 1 bushel off on yield, took 90 million out of supply. Well, that sounds good. They increased crush 10 million. That sounds good. And then the USDA, they didn't take a 2x4, they took a 2x12 or a 4x8. Two big people slamming it against the side of our head because they decided to reduce soybean exports 160 million bushel in 1 month. Guys, that's never happened before. USDA is known for gradually making changes so that we don't upset the market, but they also sometimes are bold and come out with things like this to say, hey folks, wake up. We got a problem here. This is finally realizing the effects of the trade war. Now, you said earlier that we're making progress. Maybe we're going to get this thing settled. What I read between the lines here is the USDA says, number one, we've missed a lot of business that we're probably not going to be able to get back. And I think the other underlying theme could be, don't believe everything you read in the press because this thing could last a long time. This thing could last 1 to 2 years. This is not about trade. I know it's called a trade war. It's not about U.S. beans and Chinese trinkets. It's much deeper than that. It's the plan that China has to be militarily superior in the world over the U.S. Do we want that? Technology, patent infringement, control of the South China Sea. All of these things are really the core of the problem, and that's what President Trump is saying. The trade thing is on the top, it gets public press, but there are things much deeper than that we have to address. And you know what the rest of the world is saying? It's about time, right? Unfortunately, who's bearing the burden of this trade war right now? The American farmer, and the American consumer, and the Chinese consumer. So anyway, 160 off down to 1.9 billion. So in the end here, we lost 90 million of supply. We lost 161 million of demand. So carryout, rather than going down off the yield reduction, went up 70 million bushel to 955. If you were to survey the experts in the grain business, the ADMs, the Bungys, the Cargills, I think most traders would tell you that this is a step in the right direction, but there's a very good possibility it's not done going up. And I think people would tell you right now they really sincerely believe that this carryout on beans could grow as high as 1.2 billion, which would be left over on August 31st before we start harvesting another crop. Do you see now why the market's telling you what are you supposed to do in 2019? Plant what? Plant more corn, plant an alternative crop, but plant fewer beans because we've just got too many. What about price? 760 to 960. You see what they did is they brought the bottom end up 25, brought the top end down 25. So the average price projection on beans, $8.60. Are we there today? No, starting out the day we were just barely around $8. So the market has a fair amount of work just even to get to that average price. And honestly, today, based on the numbers that we received last week, I cannot give you a scenario, a realistic scenario that would say we could get up to that upper end. Okay, we plant 6 million less acres in the U.S., we have a drought. Miraculously, the crop of 120 million metric ton in Brazil shrinks to 50. Okay, then we can get to 960 beans. Is there much of a possibility of that happening? Probably not. So, it's going to be a challenging year on soybean marketing. And when we look at the perspective of soybean ending stocks, you can kind of see why. This looks like it's got to be a misprint, right? The printer went haywire. This can't be right. Guys, just three to 4 years ago, this carryout on soybeans in the U.S. was under 200 million bushel. 192 million, remember that? And now we're talking it could be as high as 1.2 billion. Stocks to use ratio at 25%. The market doesn't really know today how to address this. So it's going to take time. It's going to result in lower prices. It's going to what kind of basis should a person expect with that type of ending stock number?
Very wide.
Very wide. I mean, we thought it was terrible when bean basis was 90 under, some places $1.20 under at harvest. And it could stay much wider than normal for the entire crop year. Remember that old little nursery rhyme, Humpty Dumpty? All the king's horses, all the king's men? Well, this is kind of what our little gremlins here are doing. They're trying to get this pillar of 2018, but it's just too heavy and too big. It keeps tipping over and squashing them. Exports. We need to talk about because, we've got a good crushing industry on soybeans. We have ethanol and corn. We have feeding, all fine and good. But exports is the relief valve to get rid of the excess product when we have too much. Now, this is the inspections that came out this last Tuesday. Monday was federal offices were closed in respect to Veterans Day, so this came out Tuesday. Normally this report comes out each Monday morning about 10 o'clock. So these are current numbers through this week. We look at corn inspections. This is what's loaded and gone. These are all good. Average for the last 10 weeks, 43.7. Now the new USDA projection for this crop year is 2.45. We have 42 weeks to go in this crop year. So for the next 42 weeks, each and every week, we have to inspect at least 47.9 million bushel of corn, or else this number is possibly too high. Now that's a big chore. We've got a lot of good numbers here, but we'll show you a chart here in a minute where the U.S. has had the cheapest corn in the world for a year and a half. And really these numbers should be bigger than what they are. And the USDA, I think, by bringing this down 25 million in last Thursday's report, once again are telling us something. First of all, we know that the Brazilian farmer planted beans and corn earlier than normal, so they're going to have stuff available for export earlier than normal, which probably means by July, August, they're going to be a little more competitive. Argentina had a very serious drought a year ago, but right now the weather's pretty good in Argentina. In fact, some areas are too wet. They also planted more corn, and they tend to be pretty aggressive on exports, and we'll look at their price comparison here in a little bit. So we may have more challenges, but right now things are going okay on corn. What about soybeans? Here's our 10-week average, 36.6 million. Hey, that's pretty respectable if it was in the middle of the summer, but not this time of the year. I just read something here this morning. Do you realize last year, before this trade war, when China was aggressively buying beans and everything, these soybean inspection numbers in October were 80 to 90 million a week? So when we look at what we're doing here, they're respectable, but it's half of what it should be. And that's a big reason why the USDA hacked this down 160 million bushel down to 1.9. Now, kind of interesting, 42 weeks to go. 36.6 million a week on bean inspections to meet it, exactly where we're at right now. But what's going to happen here as we change the calendar to 2019? What do we run into each and every year? Competition from where? South America. And we know they planted early, and people are very adamant about the fact that South America, Brazil, will have exportable beans by the last week of January this year. That's 3 to 4 weeks earlier than normal. And that kind of bears out on this chart here. This looks at soybean inspections out of the U.S. for the last 5 years. Here's our current year, 2018 in black, and here's the other 4 years. Now, January to December, this is a regular calendar across the bottom. when does the U.S. typically have the world market as far as inspecting beans and exporting beans? October? Well, October, that ship sailed, hasn't it? That's gone. We didn't do it. They didn't buy a bean in October. November? Well, that's the biggest month. In November, it's, let's see, it's the 15th today. If they get together and talk the last week of November, how long is it going to take to actually put an agreement together? And then, in fact, if they get an agreement together, how many weeks does it take to get the train cars to New Vision or somewhere else to load beans to get to the export terminal, and all of a sudden we're into December? And look what happens in a normal year in December. We're still inspecting beans, but compared, we missed the heyday, right? And I think that's the other thing maybe that the USDA showed with this drastic reduction. If we were to settle the trade war with China today, we cannot go back and get that business. So if you kind of look at a snapshot like this, where did the business go? China can't do without the beans, right? And that's correct, but the US inspections on beans down about 31% as of this slide, Brazil up 24%. So basically, China went to get the beans where? Brazil. Now, other countries in the world came and bought US beans. That's fine, but keep in mind, China buys roughly 70% of all the beans traded in the world. So if you're not doing that share, you know, it really cuts into it. This was a new slide that I just put in this morning. This came out with somebody's Morning Wire, and it kind of shows what the trade war has done to U.S. exports. Soybeans on this side, and it looks at the last 6 years here. This is the other countries in purple. So if we compare the other countries in purple to this year, yes, the other countries have been buying more U.S. beans. But see, China's in the blue, and look at how this compares. See? And the challenge might be is, okay, what happens once we get this thing settled? Does anybody remember? I see some faces here that are probably as old as me or maybe a little more senior. Anybody remember the grain embargo in 1980 with Russia? What did exports do out of the U.S. after we settled that? Did they bounce right back and get better? They never recovered, did they? Some of the other embargoes that we've had over the years, you never get back to 100%. So here's the point on beans. We settle this thing with China, and let's say we were doing 30% of Chinese bean imports prior to the trade war. That could easily drop to 20. We get it settled, but now they've found we can get more beans out of South America. We don't have to rely on the U.S., and that's where we're going to go. So there's a good chance once we do get this thing resolved, we see our business volume with China drop. Now, as far as other grains here, this involves sorghum down here in the orange on the bottom. It also brings in corn. You see, the corn has increased a little bit. Soybeans definitely down some, and sorghum has disappeared completely because pretty much almost all of our exports on sorghum had been going to China, and they've pretty much cut off everything. So definitely has an impact on U.S. grains when we do not get the exports that we need. Here's the slide I was talking about as far as how we compare with prices to the rest of the world. This is an FOB corn price. In other words, if you load a boat in the U.S. Gulf, U.S. PNW, or Brazil, Argentina, or the Ukraine, this is the price of that corn in the vessel going to customers in the world. The U.S. Gulf in the blue, and you can see we can go all the way back to 2017, and we've been the cheapest corn in the world. Area to be a little bit careful about, though, is this lime green one is Argentina, and we see now that as they're giving price indications nearby that say they're going to be competitive or even below the U.S. And I think that there again a sign of maybe why the USDA dropped that corn inspection number down a little bit for the year. It looks like weather's going to be better, Argentina's going to have more corn, and they're going to price it accordingly and get back into the market. What about soybeans? Here's U.S. Gulf soybeans. Here's Brazil and Argentina. Do you see why the rest of the world is buying beans at the U.S.? They're buying them somewhere between $1.25 and $2 a bushel cheaper because of the tariff. Now, even if you're in China, take politics aside, where should China be buying their beans today? Probably from the U.S., but they're not going to because of the political implications. Because they don't want to look like they gave in to the U.S., that they lost. And that's why this thing could drag out. There's a big thing called national pride in China that the whole Communist Party and the president of China is very concerned about. He doesn't want to look like he let his people down. And right now they are rallying, even though they're paying more for their meat and everything else, they're rallying behind their president because he's standing up against the big bad democracy in the United States, right? As far as world ending stocks, now we get into the China corn surprise. If you've been at some of our previous meetings, we have been talking about ending stocks of corn for the world being around 198, 199 million metric ton. I apologize, but the rest of the world still is on metrics, so they don't talk bushels. I remember when I was in grade school, they tried to teach us metrics. That's a long time ago, and we still haven't learned, right? Anyway, 198 for last crop year, dropping down to 159, which have been only about a 38-day supply. That's getting pretty tight for the corn. Another reason why corn has found some good support here lately. Well, a lot of the trade thought that this was a misprint initially. Did anybody watch their market screen when the report came out last week at 11 o'clock? The first thing that they seen, the market, was that the yield had dropped 1.8 bushel and corn immediately shot up 7-8 cents. And then all of a sudden, within milliseconds, it dropped to about 7 or 8 lower because they looked at this number and said, well, this can't be right. We almost doubled the ending stocks of corn for the world. And they called the USDA and said, this has got to be a misprint. And they said, no, it's right. And then we look at the current year, 159 all the way up to 307, change of 149 million metric ton. What happened? Well, we kind of fell asleep on this thing, quite honestly. And there were a few people. We know an analyst from INTL FC Stone who has been saying for months, something doesn't feel right with the Chinese corn numbers. Because remember, for the last year plus, they've been selling corn stocks out of the government reserves in China, right? And they release each week what they've sold, and they had sold over 100 million bushel of corn. And the market thought their ending stocks on corn in China were 100 million metric ton. And they said, well, gosh, if they're selling themselves completely out of corn, they're going to return to the world as a big buyer of corn or feed grains. But it wasn't happening. Well, about every 10 years, China does a census on their grain production and grain usage. And that's what they did. And they had announced early last week, prior to the report, that there was a revision coming. And everybody thought, well, the USDA will get around to it in 6 months. It'll take time. They'll gradually bring it in. Well, the USDA brought it all in at once. And they went back and revised both production and usage. So rather than the ending stocks in China being around 100 million metric ton, and on the downhill side, China's new numbers showed their ending stocks at 222 million metric ton. Now, if we look at how that compares to the new revised number of 340, we see that 67.5% of the world ending stocks of corn are located where? In China. Is that corn available to the market?
Not today.
Not today, and in the past, we'd probably say no. So if they're sitting on this much corn, we can do a few what ifs. We can say, well, maybe they could return to the market as an exporter. Years and years ago they did that. Would that be good for the corn market? No, but it's probably not real likely. We can also say that maybe they've got all this corn because it's what? It's out of condition. It's unmarketable. We can say this isn't all bad news because when we look here in a minute at how much production they added, they're actually using corn faster than what we thought. Or the other thing we can think about is maybe they knew this day was coming where they would be in the middle of a trade war and they would need these excess stocks. Could that be the reason that maybe they aren't buying as much beans because they stored a lot more beans getting ready for this? They've known since 2016 when President Trump was elected that this day was coming. Trust me, they did. He had made comments during his campaign that stuff like this was going to be fixed. So in this report, we see ending stocks for the world up 149 million metric ton. These are the slides that the USDA released to show how they arrived at that. China went back 10 years and revised all of their production, and all of this red in November were production increases that they showed from year to year. In fact, if you add the 10 years up, they added 297 million metric ton. Guys, that's a little over 10 billion bushel. It's a lot of corn. Could be really berries if it's available, but then they also said, we also revised our feed and residual usage, and we used 141 million metric ton more than what we had previously reported. So you see, the demand on China is even bigger than what we thought. Net change was 149 million metric ton. This is a lot of corn because if we convert this to bushels, this is 5.8 billion bushel. It's a big deal. But I think as we got beyond the report day, people started realizing today it's really not available, so it really doesn't affect the rest of the world. And if you take China and the U.S. stocks out of that world ending stock number, you raised the daily supply of corn in the world 1 day to 39 days, which is still pretty tight, which means demand is still probably building faster than what our production is, and we have to be careful for any weather problems in the world that raise corn. One other area we have to kind of keep in mind. Yes?
Raised their production.
Yep.
Million,
Yep.
what is their normal production by a year?
Well, I think they raised this last crop, I think it's 225 million metric ton. We'll look at give me just a minute on a slide. We got a slide coming up here that looks at U.S. corn production and also has China on there, and we can figure it out from there. Good question, though. One other area we can't forget about is the Ukraine. Keep in mind that the Ukraine now is becoming more active. Communism is gone. Ukraine land type and climate, you look at where that's at, it's very similar to where we're at. So they can raise corn and beans there. They haven't in the past, but things are changing. And there's a lot of dialogue going on between China and Russia about working together once again so that you aren't dependent on the rest of the world, especially the U.S. So we see both yield and production also going up on corn in the Ukraine. Here's our world soybean update, and we want to point out a few things here. First of all, for the last crop year, 2017-18, final USDA numbers had total bean imports, not just from the U.S. This is total for China at 94.1. Now, why is it important to look at that? Because as we went through the last crop year that ended on August 31st, this number was projected to be 97 million metric ton. So you see, China actually was tapping the brakes on bean usage as we went through the last year. Now, when this was at 97 million metric ton a year ago, or for this crop year, remember if we look at like the last 10 years, that Chinese import demand has been growing at the rate of 3 to 5 million metric ton per year without exception. So when the market looked at this projection last year of 97, they were expecting this year to be what? 100 to 102. Still growing. And keep in mind, the whole world, US, Brazil, Argentina, Ukraine, even China, everybody was trying to raise more beans to meet this growing Chinese demand. And now all of a sudden it's starting to slow down. And in the November report, the USDA number for the current crop year has it dropping down to 90. Remember, before that, the market was thinking it was 100 to 102. That's a big deal. And then after the report, the U.S. attaché out of Beijing came out and said, we think this number is too high. We think it could be as low as 84 to 85 million metric ton. So now you've got the whole world raising more beans, and you've got the number one customer doing what? Publicly stating that they're taking protein in their swine rations from 20% to 17%. Is that a big deal? It is in China, because they've got somewhere between 600 and 700 million head of hogs. Now, does it work? You can go to K-State and ask a nutritionist, and they'll say there's no way. But in China, if the government comes out and says you will now feed your hogs 17% protein rather than 20, what are you going to do? Doesn't matter if it works, right? That's what you're going to do. Or they'll find somebody else, or you won't have a job, or you won't be around, right? Different world than what we're used to. So there's area of concerns here that we have to be kind of careful of. And we look at usage at China going down, but we look at total soybean production of the world projected to go up 28 million metric ton. So all of a sudden now, rather than stocks getting tighter in the world like on corn, bean stocks, not only in the U.S. but globally, are growing. This is probably one of the most depressing slides in the whole presentation. It looks at soybean ending stocks, a history in the Americas. So we're going to bring both North and South America into the picture here. And Brazil is in Vikings purple, Saints gold, and blue for the U.S. Now when we look at what's evolved over here for the last 8 years, you see the purple, the Brazil, their ending stocks. When Brazil raises soybeans, what are they going to do with them? Get rid of them. Crush them, export them, year to year, we don't care. We raise them to sell them, they're gone. What about Argentina? Well, we've seen this take off. What's going on in Argentina when they're holding more beans? What was happening down there? Two things. Inflation running 22 to 26%, out of control. They hold their beans as a hedge against inflation. The other thing was export tax. Weather to some degree, but more of the export tax, which was 35% plus. New president come in and said, I'm going to take that to 0. He got it down to 30, and then he said, wait a minute, I need that revenue to operate the government, so we're going to kind of freeze it there. So they still have the export tax. Remember, in meetings past, when not necessarily you, I jest and joked about the fact that look at those Argentinas. They've got over 1 billion bushel carry out of beans. And we laughed about that. Who's laughing now? Now who has 1 billion bushel carry out of beans and has less than 2% inflation and doesn't have an export tax? Kind of daunting, isn't it? Crop production in South America for the year, and this stuff is, boy, I tell you, like I said, they planted earlier. A lot of this stuff is in the ground doing well. Brazil's got plenty of moisture. Projected right now for the Brazilian corn crop to be about 94.5 million metric ton, 42.5 in Argentina. This is a pretty decent crop in Brazil. This is definitely up from a year ago because they aren't having a drought right now. 120.5 on the Brazilian bean crop would be an all-time record. Last year, their record crop was 119.8. But I'll tell you something, I was reading last night, conditions right now are so good in Brazil that if their crop finishes the way it potentially could, there are people that are thinking this Brazilian crop could end up being somewhere between 125 to 130 million metric ton. I really hope that doesn't happen, but the potential is there. They're getting much better in their management practices, and things are working. And keep in mind, they had an incentive to really be aggressive on their beans, because when that trade war went into effect with the U.S., what happened to the Brazilian basis? It went up like $2, almost $2 a bushel. They took advantage of that. So not going to get any easier is probably the bottom line there. Here's the slide on corn production for the world, so hopefully we can answer your question. Here's the U.S. Here's our 14.6 billion bushel crop. Number 2 corn producer in the world is China. Right now, with a revised number, I think they took their crop up to around 250. That would be around 10 million bushel, 10 billion bushel. Okay? Does that answer your question? You can see that the U.S., whether this is genetics, good Lord, or weather, a combination of the two, pretty significant uptrend. And you see really that same type of uptrend. Even though they're lower than our yields, Chinese corn production has been doing better. We also have Brazil and Argentina down here, and slight uptrends, but they're not big, really major corn producers. Really the two main players in the world are the U.S. and China. Soybean side, here's the U.S. crop in blue, 4.6 billion. Brazil is in red. You can see if Brazil has the type of crop that people think right now, this could be the year where Brazil becomes the largest single soybean producing country in the world. U.S. has had that title for, well, forever. More and more, and you can see the growth of bean production in Brazil in these red lines. You look at Argentina in the gold bars, it doesn't change much. Really, the only thing that changes in Argentina is if you have, it shortens up like in a year like here where you had a drought. Weather can affect it, but for the most part. But Brazil, you've got better yields and more acres coming into production just about every year. A little different way. Now this converts everything as far as soybean productions into the metrics. So the 4.6 billion bushel crop in the U.S. is actually 125 million metric ton. Projected by Brazil at 120, so you see very close right now, and the possibility that Brazil could overtake us this year. Argentina, here's their drought damaged crop last year at 37, this year projected at 55. Once again, you bring weather back into it, so there's a very good possibility this year you end up with more beans in Brazil than a year ago and many more beans in Argentina. Now, this is pretty important for the crushing industry in the U.S. too, because Argentina typically takes their beans, crushes them into meal and oil, and exports the products, not the whole beans. Very, very small percentage of Argentine beans are exported as whole beans. So when they had a short crop a year ago, that took a lot of the Argentina meal out of the market because they weren't crushing as much, which gave phenomenal crushing margins to companies in the U.S. like AGP, CHS, ADM, M&SP. It's going to get tougher for those folks probably in crush margins, that were $1.70 to $2 a year ago because of the export demand on meal, because of the drought in Argentina. Those margins right now are probably closer to 90 cents to $1. So it's kind of gotten a little bit tougher there. We also see that China, as far as their production, they raise about 15 to 16 million metric ton of beans on their own. They say, and they've put out a paper saying that they intend to get this up over 20 million metric ton by 2020. It's probably not going to be a big move, but they're going to verbally put out news that they want to do more of their own. Some of the other producers pretty much unchanged. Any questions on grains? Now we're going to talk a little bit about weather.
When did they announce that? When did they decide to start putting less protein in their hog feed?
Oh, that story broke, I'm guessing, a couple of weeks ago.
Would that be any indication that without the United States they can't source enough beans?
Yes, but they wouldn't admit that. But that was really kind of a twofold thing. When they came out, they said that we're going to cut the protein down, and we're also going to look for alternative proteins. We're going to buy more canola meal. And that to a fact, we use a little bit of canola meal at New Vision, not a lot, but we do use some, especially the dairies really like to have that in their rations. And so every once in a while, I don't know, maybe once a month or so, I have to go out and buy canola meal. And when I talk to canola buyers, the basis on canola meal has been extremely strong, stronger than normal. I said, why is that? Because I know they had a record crop of canola in Canada this year. I said it's demand for China. China is basically taking all the canola meal we're willing to sell. Rapeseed meal, any other types of meal they're investigating. And some of it might just be lip service to make us think, but I think you're hitting it on the head. They're slowing this stuff down because it's getting tougher and getting more expensive to source the protein. Can can they raise enough meat to feed their people? That's $1 million question too. But the other thing is, if we, and this would be good for the U.S., if we can get this trade thing worked out, China's like our number 2 buyer of U.S. pork. And the way our pork industry is expanding, we need that export market. So that, we don't hear a lot of talk about that, but that's the main reason they bought Smithfield. In fact, if you look at a grocery store in China, I've seen pictures, and there's Chinese pork, and then there's made in the USA pork with a Smithfield label. And guess what the consumer wants to buy? They'll buy Smithfield because they know it's a safer product. A lot of concerns in China on the consumer side about food safety because of some of the problems they've had in the past. Okay, weather. This is kind of a global snapshot, and this, you notice, is in October, the month of October, early October. South America here, North America here. This is the equator. And if you notice, it looks like things are kind of transitioning. Last year when we were talking about a La Nina is cooler than normal SSTs, or sea surface temperatures, along the equator off the coast of South America. If it was cooler than normal, it would be these blue colors. So you can kind of see along the equator, it's not blue anymore, is it? So we're done with La Nina, and it looks like it's kind of transitioning. Also at that time, an area that they watch are the sea surface temperatures up off the coast of Alaska. A few years ago, we talked about the blob. This is the blob again. And at that point in time in October, temperatures up here, cooler than normal. Now let's flip ahead to the first week in November. South America, the equator. What's happened to sea surface temperatures along the equator now? Warmed substantially, right? Enough to officially put us into a El Nino, which is warmer than normal sea surface temperatures along the equator. What's also happened up in the blob off the coast of Alaska? We went from cooler than normal to major change, much warmer than normal. Now, if we were in the middle of a growing season and we had this scenario, what would we be talking about weather in the midsection of the U.S.? Warm and dry. Warmer than normal and dry. Drought type fears. That would be good. Nice rally, right? But the problem is, this time of the year, what are we growing? So it doesn't mean anything as far as crop production, but it may mean something as far as human comfort for us. World Weather came out with their extended forecast over this past weekend, and they said we found 2 analog years that have similarities to this, where we have an El Nino and we have warmer sea surface temperatures up in the blob. The 2 analog time frames that they found were 2004-2005 and 2014-2015. When they looked at all the information, they said, we think this is the scenario that we follow this year, 2018-19. What does that mean? Well, for temperatures, white states would be normal. So when you see these tans and darker browns, this is normal to above normal temperatures for December through February. There is a God, right? What about precip? Normal, dry in the PNW, the western states, quite wet to the east, but for us, on the dry side. So when they put that into a layman's type map, here's what they come up with forecasts for November through February. The green is normal on this temperature map. So when you have green with yellow specks, you're normal to above normal on temperatures. And on precip, green is normal. When you have these brown speckles, you're normal to below normal. So what they're saying, we should expect November through February weather, warmer than normal, drier than normal. Isn't that wonderful? We wait for years like this. So the snowbirds that go south are calling back complaining how cold it is down south, and we're saying, what do you mean? It's 40 degrees here. Not below either. Where's the money at in the market? So we look at our commodity funds, and here's corn. Through yesterday's close, they're a slight long in the corn market, about 6,500 contracts. They're short about 45,000 contracts of beans. So a lot of the information that we looked at, you know, it can look fairly bearish on beans and a little bit friendly on corn, kind of where the money has it positioned right now. So when should I sell my grain? We've used this slide for years and years and years. Listen to what the market's telling you to do. You know, there's two components in that pricing decision, the futures price and also the local basis. And they don't have to be done at the same time. Now, when we talk basis, what's the time or what causes the basis to get narrower or stronger? What's the number one reason?
Product isn't available or short.
Yeah, could be short supply, could be increased demand, but really overriding all of that, it's what the farmer's doing, right? If the farmer's selling on a regular basis, basis doesn't do anything. If the farmer finishes harvest, locks the bin, doesn't sell anything, doesn't like the price, doesn't like the basis, what usually happens? It narrows. Kind of maybe the environment that we're in right now. So, you know, we want to try and get that, watch for that opportunity to lock in the future prices, but we also need to watch the basis, and I think we're maybe in that environment right now. But to make this all work, we kind of have to have a marketing plan. And we've got two people that do an excellent job here at New Vision, Jim and John, that can work with you on that. Doesn't have to be real elaborate. I know one guy whose marketing plan is, I have all my corn sold by the time I finish planting corn in the spring. And you may say, well, that's no marketing plan. Hey, I've seen this guy and it works a lot of years. He does the same thing on beans. When he finishes beans, he makes sure he has his new crop production sold. It can be as simple as that. It can be much more detailed, and these guys can help work through that. Here's our nearby corn chart. And it kind of makes sense with what we've talked about. Ending stocks on corn have been gradually coming down. And if we look back on a daily continuation chart, since last July, corn market's been a nice little uptrend. Does anybody remember what corn prices were a year ago? When I put these meetings together, I always go back to the previous year, so I went back to November of 17 and said, what was the price of cash corn? Does anybody remember what it was? Not exactly, but close. Under $3. We forget about that, don't we? We're complaining about corn prices now, and it's $3.35, and a year ago it was under $3. Boy, we must have really been complaining then, right? Not saying these are good prices, but the fact of the matter is corn market has been working higher. We're kind of stuck in a range. We look at the extremes of about 360 on nearby corn in Chicago and the high of about 378, 379. If you bring that range in a little bit, you'll see the majority of the time we're trading between 365 and 375 for the last few months. We need to punch through this up here. And maybe this thing gains traction with getting this China thing settled. And if beans start working higher, corn will get drug along too. And if we could take out this 379, 380 area, see right here it goes all the way back to June, 379 3/4. We take that out, now we can go up and go after this gap, which is under 390, or maybe even up to like 395. And that's the time to go to the brokerage office and buy futures and options, right? No. What are you going to do if that happens? You start making some sales, right? And if we look at a weekly chart, a little longer perspective, this looks even more friendly because we can go back now into 2016 and we're really in an uptrend on corn. Not that we're in fantastic prices, but it's trending higher. As this carryout comes down, the demand is strong, corn market looks pretty sound. What about beans? Continuation chart on beans, quite honestly. If you look at history, we talked about learning from the past. If you look at history, in a billion bushel carryout of beans, we don't have any history, right? So we really don't know. Our common sense would say there's no reason to have an 8 in front of a bean futures price, right? In fact, it should be 6 or below, but the market decides. And right now I think what they're saying is the funds are already short beans and they don't want to push it lower right now because if they want to sell it, somebody has to be there to buy it, and maybe they just want to wait and see. So on beans, we've kind of been trading in a similar type range, about 865 on nearby beans, up to about 875, maybe 880. Now today, with this news bubbling about a written plan from China being sent to Washington about ongoing talks to prepare for this G20 summit meeting the last week in November, you know, the market's excited. Bean market, this is basically when the tariffs start going into effect, right? Let's see, what did we do? 976. We took what, $1.25 off of beans? Now we're probably not going to get that all back, but if we get some emotion going, could this bean market rally 50 to 75 cents to $1 a bushel just off of even tweets? And that's the time to say they got it right, I'm going to store my beans, right? Remember, 860 is that average price, and if for some reason we start getting up there, getting a little bit higher, keep in mind these beans aren't going to disappear. It's going to take us time to work through some of these excesses. And this is kind of what's happened. This chart is updated as of this morning, so you can kind of see what happened here off of this news that we received this proposal, and it looks like we might actually have some grounds to go on. Weekly chart of beans, you can kind of see we were up in this level for quite a while, but now with this carryout where it's at right now, we've shifted down. And for us to get back up into these $10 to $11 bean futures, it's going to take more than settling this agreement or rumors that we're going to settle it, I think, right now. So we have to be a little bit defensive. What should I do? Watch, and I would actually expect improvements in both corn and soybean basis in the coming days and weeks. A lot of that's built off the fact that the farmer's not selling. Now we do have a couple of things to be one thing to be a little bit concerned about as far as basis to appreciate much further. And a big one is on ethanol demand. Because I don't know if anybody's watched or not, but it'd be interesting for you to go pull up a natural gas chart, weekly or monthly. This week we have taken natural gas prices higher than we've been for 4 years. What does that mean to corn and beans? Who's a big user of natural gas when they convert corn into ethanol? And what's that?
The ethanol.
The ethanol plants. And I'm just now starting to get vibes from ethanol plants and companies that, the price of DDGs might be going up a little bit and the available supply might be going down a little bit because we're dialing the plant back. This natural gas thing is getting out of control. And you see, the thing is, that affects their processing margins, and the other thing is their cost of corn. So if we want basis to get better, and our export market is kind of okay, it's not really crazy, so ethanol is going to be a big driver there, and if their margins are being squeezed, they may be reluctant to pay more for the corn to keep processing, and they may need less. So that's a little bit of a negative. And also on the soybean processing side, a lot of plants use natural gas. This affects their cost or their crush margins there. But normally, when harvest is about 2/3 done, on corn and beans, you see a natural appreciation of basis to some degree. In Monday's harvest progress report, or Tuesday actually it came out, corn was 84% harvested, and I think beans were 88%. So, we're beyond that point. We probably would continue to see some basis in appreciation. Watch commodity fund position changes. We looked at the fact there's slight longs in corn right now, pretty short on beans. Who knows? Even though the fundamentals are so negative you can't see straight, if the money decides they don't want to be short beans, what's going to happen to bean futures? It's going to go up, right? It happened with crude oil a few years ago. The fundamentals were so bearish, they were just terrible. And crude took off on a rampage and doubled doubled price in the course of 2 years. Average prices in the price ranges for the coming year, $3.20 to $4 on corn, an average of $3.60. Remember, we want to shoot for this in our marketing plan, and then as we get closer to the upper end, we want to get more aggressive and get stuff cleaned out. Beans, $7.60 to $9.60, average of $8.60. Your on-farm grain, what is the market telling us to do? It's still telling you to sell the carries. Now, I have to be real careful about saying this because I've got a board member present and I've got employees present and our CEOs in the other office, but I'm going to tell you right now, if you've got elevator grain, what's the first grain you should be selling? The elevator. Stop the storage. Stop the service fees. I shouldn't say that because we like the storage revenue, but it's not in your best interest, right? Now here's the thing that is in your best interest, and this is something your cooperative has provided for you for over 20 years, and that's no minimum storage. Compared to some of the competition that has a 25 or 30 cent minimum storage that you have to sell by the end of December, use it or lose it, you know, that's a big thing. That it makes it hard to market. But when you have no minimum storage, if bean basis or corn basis improves a dime over the course of a few weeks or a month, what does that storage cost you at New Vision? It's at a daily rate, at most 4 cents for the entire month. That's in your best interest. That's your cooperative working for you. And it can really help you in your marketing. But manage that cost. You know, this stuff here, once you've got the bin up at home, the land underneath it's paid for, the bin's paid for, it's free to store grain, right? Well, to some degree. It's freer than commercial storage, so sell that first. Watch for the El Nino effects. Watch the market indicators as far as relative strength index and stochastics. Respect and reward market rallies. Be like Brazil. Raise a crop to market it and to sell it, to move it when we get that opportunities. Don't get too bullish at the wrong time. Here's our bid page from yesterday. What do we mean when we say sell the carries on corn? 333 for corn all the way from now through January. That's a flat market. A carrying charge market is one where the deferred prices are higher. So now August corn at 350, 17 cents higher. Now you've noticed if you were at our last meeting, we talked about this, and I think at that time this carry from new crop out to next summer was 30 or 32 cents. Now that's almost been cut in half. What's happening? This basis nearby is doing what? Tightening, taking some of the carry out of the market to try and provide an incentive for farmers to move some grain. Because our annual usage on corn is 15 billion bushels, so we're using, what, 1.25 billion bushel of corn every month? The market has to keep buying corn. If it can't do it by price, it'll use basis to try and regulate that flow. Now, 3,400 December looks like not too bad a basis, but pretty soon we're going to be basis the March, so now we're talking 4,500 the March, but you know, keep an eye on that. You can do a basis contract. Jim has some ideas that would, once again, stop the storage and convert it to some type of basis contract where the futures market can still go up. Follow me? One other thing I want to point out here. We don't want to lose track. I mean, I know the focus now. We just finished harvesting. The bins are full. I hauled the over onto New Vision. I'm paying storage. My focus is on old crop grain. That's what I'm thinking about. But what do we also have to be thinking about? I think most everybody here is going to farm another year, right? So you're only a few months away from planting another crop. And the market today is telling every farmer in America to do what with their crop mix for the coming year? Plant more what? Plant more corn. Last thing you want to do is plant beans. And the market believes right now today that the American farmer is going to plant somewhere between 3 to 4 to 5 million more acres of corn. Now, I realize that depends on seed availability, weather, all of the above, but if that is what the market intends to do we also need to be watching new crop corn prices? Because you look at this 344 plus 55, that's what? Basically $4 corn futures, right? Now, I'm sorry, this may not be at or even close to your cost of production, but if we plant 4 to 5 million more acres of corn, do you suppose that market's going to rally? And if we get a rally off of some of this other news and you get that December corn price up to 415 to 425, might you want to maybe have some protection on? Because we seen that last year. We got up to 415, a little bit higher, and we all sat back and said, well, we're just going to wait for a little bit more, and then what happened? She came down and never looked back, right? What about beans? $7.97 on spot beans. You can store them all the way out to next harvest if you want. Put them in the bin and forget about them. $8.51. Not recommending that, but you have a nice carry here, farm stored beans. Don't care about the sub $8 price. Look to sell this carry. Keep the beans in position, deliver them late next summer. Now just the opposite on beans. If in fact the market believes right now that the American farmer plants 5 to 6 million less soybean acres, you probably don't want to focus on marketing much out here, do you? At worst, maybe it goes sideways. Questions on that? One thing I want to leave you with, I don't know if you can tell or not, but I really like doing these meetings. I've got a passion for it and I like helping you. But I also like to leave you with something that has to do with life, because there's more to it than farming or buying ingredients or doing all this stuff that we think is real important. So if you have gifts, and we all do, right? Accomplishments, honors, blessings, and influence, make them matters of thanksgiving. That's next week. And treat them all as gifts of God. That includes our families, right? To be used in the service of Christ and each other. That's why we're on this earth. It's not about trying to get the best prices and stuff. There's other things to focus on. Keep your eyes on Jesus and live a life of humble thanksgiving and Christ-centered service. Pride always overemphasizes self. Our hearts need to be God-focused and not self-focused, focused on others and helping others, right? I wish you a happy Thanksgiving. Thank you for coming. And now Jim has a few things he would like to discuss.